let's talk about politics, because the unofficial election campaign has kicked off and the guns, well, they're blazing already. I say unofficial, right, because the PM hasn't yet fired the starting gun. Now, I actually thought that he would just after Australia Day, but the polls, they've clearly put paid to those plans. Now, we know, and we're going to talk later, about how the last election, the polls were wrong, just as they were wrong for Brexit and Trump in 2016. But this time, I actually do think they're pretty reflective of where the country is currently at. Now, I'm not sure that's entirely fair, but politics is rarely fair. What I pick up, though, isn't actually really good for the government. A news poll today, you probably saw it, it's got a two-party vote of 56 to 44 Labor's way. Now, if that transpired an election, then it would be a Labor landslide. And that's a huge problem for all of us. Believe me when I say that things will tighten up over coming months, but it's a long way home for the coalition, and even the most optimistic punter would struggle to put too much money on them from here. Now, part of that reason is because they've been around for 3 terms, so there's a bit of boredom and, maybe the other mob should have a go. But I reckon a lot of it's actually been own goals, being slightly less bad than Labor and the Greens on climate policy and the other political culture battles isn't perhaps the best campaign slogan for disgruntled Conservatives. What it's done is it's pushed some of those people, some traditional liberal thinkers, into the arms of the minor parties. But aside from that, there's been some much bigger strategic blunders than policy announcements, because they can be reversed, understand that. But strategic blunders sort of paint a very firm and set picture in the minds of the electorate, and that's the big problem. And part of that problem was the PM's abundance of goodwill, if I can put it like that. Well, maybe it was naivety. He actually threw his lot in with the state premiers. Now, if you look around the country, they're an assorted bunch of hardcore, battle-tested Labor tough nuts. And then on the Liberal side, well, they're a bunch of Liberal sops, with the exception of Dom Perrottet, who can't be blamed for this, what's happened over the last couple of years. So when push comes to shove, no matter how much love-in there is, the Labor lovies do all the pushing and shoving, while the Liberal premiers, well, they meekly stand back and they take it. They cave into bureaucrats and bullying at almost every turn. That's not what they were elected to do. And so my problem is this: the PM's failure was actually to allow Labor premiers to write the narrative. They actually claim credit for anything that was publicly popular, and anything that sort of didn't move the polls the right way, they shoved that onto the federal government. National Cabinet, quite frankly, was a disaster. It was well-intentioned, that's the naivety or the goodwill of the PM, but it was always a leaky ship that elevated state premiers well above their status. And that enabled them to turn all the focus onto the federal government whenever they wanted to, and it helped them to avoid scrutiny on behalf of the federal opposition. Because all we've been doing is talking about the government. That is the mood I'm detecting right now. No one is talking to me about Albo or his hard left past. No one is looking at his team of hard left socialists, who are all hiding under sheep's cloaks until they can reveal themselves as wolves after the election, of course. And today, seemingly for the very first time ever, was the only time a journo actually had the guts to question him on how in the world he's expected to finance his cash splash extravaganza of promises he's making left, right and centre. Now, his explanation, of course, it sounded typical of the fiscal management the left are so notoriously beguiled by. Have a listen.
How are you going to pay for these things? How do you pay for your promises without either increasing taxes, the level of taxation, or cutting costs?
Well, all our promise. Well, one of the things that we won't do, Neil, here's $16 billion worth of savings. So in the mid-year economic forecast, they've put $16 billion aside for decisions taken but not yet announced. The sort of political pork barrelling that we've seen from this government is one area that you can make a difference.
Okay, do you remember 3 years ago? The polls were equally dire for the coalition. But despite those polls, all the talk was about how Bill Shorten would be a disaster for the country. Now, we're all distracted with COVID and Anyway, the narrative is they're blaming every woe on Scott Morrison. And the focus is entirely on him. Whatever strengths he does have, and some are formidable, I've got to tell you, consistency and predictability, I wouldn't count as two of them. And he's now even got his own ministers conceding they understand why, after the summer of Omicron discontent, voters actually might not be thrilled.
On current trends, you'll be in opposition in a few months' time. Do you see it that way?
Polls come and go. We've all seen that over many, many years. It's been a tough 2 years, Peter. It's been tough for a lot of Australians. It's been difficult. It's been frustrating for everyone. Finally, we're seeing kids going back to school. Finally, we're seeing a normalcy returning to workplaces. But I understand people's frustrations.
Well, that's another reason some Libs have run to the crossbench. And so if the coalition want to actually win this election, it's going to take every ounce of grit and campaign skill from the Prime Minister. But he's actually got to start to turn the blowtorch onto the alternative Prime Minister. And there are plenty of vulnerabilities there that I think would strike an immediate chord with the electorate. Now, the main weakness that even blind Freddie could see here, it's each way Albo and his insistence on kowtowing to China's aggression. Now, China is a very difficult business partner. We understand that. But we also have to understand it isn't an ally, and it's unlikely to ever be an ally. We don't like the human rights abuses of their coercive tactics. We don't like their military power. It is a problem. And the brown bag diplomacy known as Belt and Road that's polluting the Pacific, it's downright grubby. Now, of course, it gets much worse than that, but the ALP machine, they've repeatedly demonstrated that they're willing to not see whatever they don't want to see. So no matter what he says, Albanese doesn't have a track record of sticking up for Taiwan or the Uyghurs or defending Australia's interests against the militarisation of the South China Sea. And these are huge problems. But maybe it's just me. But if a few lines to placate and deflect the journalists during a speech to the press club, they don't, and they never will override a lifetime of commitment to hard left causes.
You can have an Australian policy that would be exactly the same on the Uyghurs, on Hong Kong, on Taiwan, on the South China Sea, on human rights, but still have an economic relationship that the Howard government had and that is important in the region. The rise of China is a fact of our times.
Look, if that isn't a microcosm of each way Albo and his attempt to appease both sides of the fence, I don't know what is. So let's give him the benefit of the doubt for a second. If Albanese truly has had a road to Damascus conversion, do you really think he'd still be leader of the Labor Party? But who knows? Maybe he did make a few New Year's resolutions to help him win the election, because that's what it's all about. Now, speaking of New Year's resolutions, I know I made a few of them, and some of you probably did as well. So why would I revisit them now? Well, because I'm told it takes a month or so to develop a new habit, and today it's the end of the first month. So how did you go? You lost that weight yet? You're keeping up the exercise regime? Well, I don't mind saying that I've kept most of mine up. I've actually been trying to learn Spanish. I spend some time doing that every day via an app. I play my guitar regularly. I'm still terrible at it. And I'm fiercely motivated by my 16-year-old niece who regularly beats me to improve my chess game. Now, my wife unkindly says they're my third or fourth midlife crisis, but I remind her it's cheaper and healthier than a shiny red Ferrari. And speaking of red things, today is also Chinese New Year's Eve. And to all those celebrating their cultural tradition in this great country, I wish you nothing but the best for the year of the tiger. You can bet your bottom dollar there'll be a few tigers chasing their tails this year every state and federal elections. We mop up after the pandemic response. And I think a few people in this country are going to wake up to just how much has changed in a relatively short space of time. We'll be discussing some of those changes tonight with our super panellists, and we're going to be trying to shed some light on what other media outlets try very hard to avoid discussing.